Some brands offer you low finance, or cashback, or servicing.
Renault don't do ors. We do ands. The Renault Kadjar with 1.91% APR and €1,000 cashback and 3 years servicing, saving you thousands. Renault, the brand with the ands. Visit your local Renault dealer. Finance is made under a hire purchase agreement. Terms and conditions apply. Deposit required. Subject to lending criteria. See Renault.ie.
Previously on Coffee with Kenobi.
Kind of weird and wild out there. I post things. I do a lot of grilling. If you're into grilling, I like to grill. That's our stuff on Instagram, so check that out. It's been fun.
Well, my wife is convinced that you're going to start some sort of a grilling podcast. And when you texted me the other day and said you were starting a grilling podcast, I thought, what in the world?
No, not yet. No grilling with Grievous or something like that. So.
This is Vanessa Marshall, Harrison Dula from Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
Live from the Coffee with Kenobi studios in Central Illinois, we are on the air. Jeff McGee and Mike Rodio are with us. Scott Nafziger joins me in person here at the studios. Tom Gross will do the news, and we will look at a unique motif that was first started on Dagobah and provide some insight into the spirituality of Star Wars. First off, I want to thank everybody for their kind words and feedback on last week's show. It was a really exciting thing for me to finally get this on the air. After we recorded, I probably stayed up for 3 hours recording, or not recording, but editing it. Took much more time than I thought because I kept thinking of different things I wanted to do. But it turned out beautifully. So I want to bring in our co-host, Comics with Kenobi co-host, and Marvin Dog Media's CEO, Mr. Jeff McGee.
Hello, CEO. That's funny.
I thought you'd like that. And the senior digital editor of Men's Fitness, Mike Rodio.
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be joining you.
Well, happy to have you both. Jeff, of course, is no stranger to the show. He's been on many times. He's hosted on the old iteration of the show when Corey was doing his thing. He's been on a bunch of other times besides that. And then Mike is a cool story because Mike and I met in London at Pinewood Studios, and I just love saying that sentence.
Yeah, with a bunch of costumes joining in, costumes from Rogue One, which was extra cool.
That's right. In fact, I was just listening to that show today just for a little bit of a primer. And it was fun to see the excitement because when we were at Pinewood Studios, there was just so much difference between the different levels and degrees of fandom, but Star Wars brings people together, as we know.
We also met the creator of BB-8 while we were there.
That's right.
Dan, do you remember that?
I do.
Everything about this story is making me jealous. I just want you both to know
Neil
this.
Scanlon. You should be jealous. It was
Neil Scanlon, yeah.
Neil Scanlon. He was a very cool guy. He did a lot of stuff on Rogue One as well. He was very, very kind and gracious with his time. Really passionate guy. I keep seeing him in all the making of behind-the-scenes stuff, so it makes it even cooler that we got to see him.
Right. He's that guy.
He's that guy, exactly. So, guys, I want to start today. When usually on the beginning of the show, I just, whatever's topical, what kind of is out there in the Star Wars universe. And I got an email today from Marvel. Marvel's press release for the brand new Darth Vader series coming out in June, written by Charles Soule. And I know, of course, Jeff, you are clearly an expert in Star Wars comics, being the co-host of Comics with Kenobi. What did you think of this release and all the images?
Well, first off, Matt is the expert. I'm just the guy who says, hey, Matt, tell me about this pretty picture. But we're both huge fans of Charles Soule, and everything that we saw in this release has me very excited. The only thing that I'm a little confused about is why they're just going back to the number 1 numbering, because the last Darth Vader series that ran, I believe it was 24 issues, was just called Darth Vader.
25. I
kind of wish that they would. Was it 25? Thank you. See, not the expert. But I kind of wish that Marvel would go the route that Mike Mignola has always gone with Hellboy, where each storyline gets its own numbering system and its own title. But that being said, I am very excited about this one because when they say it picks up at the end of after Revenge of the Sith, they mean immediately after the end of Revenge of the Sith. The pages that we saw that were released, the interior pages, literally start where the film ends, right before the credits. And I'm very, very excited to see where this goes. And I'm really even intrigued by the backup story that we've got with the little mouse droid that's telling on the Imperial officer who ends up getting choked.
I think personally, and I'm sure when you talk to Matt, who definitely is the ultimate in this, I think it's because it's a different arc. It's a different author and a different illustrator, so they want it to feel different. Plus, as we know, in the world of comic books, number one sells, so that's obviously not an accident either. But basically, the reason I bring this up, and I know you're going to cover this in great depth when the book comes out, and Mike, I'm not sure what kind of comic fan, and Scott, I don't think you probably read comics all that much, but when you guys, and this is a very unique show because we're at different degrees of fandom. You know, we have casual Star Wars fans, and we have passionate Star Wars fans, and then we have goofballs who dedicate a large amount of time talking about it on a podcast. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about.
So, I actually want you guys to know that I have the trade paperback of the Darth Vader series.
You do?
And I have read it.
What
I do.
You think of it?
I thought it was terrific.
It's outstanding.
It's great.
You know, as somebody who reads a lot of comics, particularly the Marvel comics, but also a number of the Batman comics, and a few, I've been following Saga as well, which I think a lot of Star Wars fans will certainly appreciate. Have you guys tried Saga yet?
I have not, but I've heard nothing but good things about it. It's one that's kind of on my list to get around to. I just haven't done it yet because I keep reading too many Star Wars comics every month.
Yes, same with me.
No such thing.
So you liked the Kieran Gillen, the 25-issue arc, which was tremendous.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it is a little bit of an adjustment, and this is sort of the case anytime you're translating something like, say, the Dan Abnett, Andy Lanning, Guardians of the Galaxy books from 2008 through 2010 or so, and then looking at it on the screen, there's always going to be those subtle differences. There's always going to be a subtle difference in even something like scripting relative to the lines in the comics, because you're sort of at the same, especially with a character like Darth Vader, you're sort of imagining him say those lines in the context of the movie as you're reading it in the book, and you're just like, well, would Darth Vader say that? I think so. I guess so. So it is especially fun with Darth Vader, I think.
Well, I think it's safe to say you passed the audition.
Absolutely. I'm curious, Mike, Rodio, what did you think of the character of Dr. Aphra in the book?
You know, I think Star Wars fans have kind of been drawn to Dr. Aphra because the character is kind of a badass, but also kind of a good guy. And that moral ambiguity seems to work in the Star Wars universe for some reason. I mean, you kind of have your Han Solos, right? You kind of have your Cassian Andors. You're having these characters who are kind of living in the moral gray area. And I think fans really like that. As opposed to some other, I would say, like sci-fi, fantasy, high drama series that are equally beloved by many people. They sort of cast their characters and have very strong light and dark. Even Lord of the Rings has pretty strong good guy, bad guy casting, if you will. And then Dr. Aphra kind of exists in the middle. Wouldn't you say? She's a female anti-hero, which we don't see much very often at all, let alone in Star Wars. And she's one that has really become a fan favorite. So I was just curious how someone who is maybe not as steeped in it as Dan and I might have thought about the character.
Well,
I will say this too. She jumps off the page in a way that not every character does in comic books, or in Star Wars.
Right. Well, I'm going to shamelessly plug my interview with Kieran Gillen on StarWars.com because he talked about the influence of Indiana Jones on that character and just sort of taking a mirror to Indiana Jones and Harrison Ford and flipping it. And really, from gender to, I guess you could say she's sort of neutral good if you wanted to throw a Dungeons and Dragons reference in there. There's a lot there. Even in the first issue with her, they've even got the droid rolling, which looks like the Boulder 2.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're going to talk a lot more about Aphra later in our news segment. But before we move on, I wanted real quickly, what do you guys think about, Darth Vader is clearly very important to Star Wars. He's probably the central figure in the entire saga. But is it good to continue to have more stories with Darth Vader, or is it better if he's just sort of a mystery?
I think personally, the stories like this, I think, are great because if you're filling in gaps, and these are stories that people do kind of wonder about. These are the parts of the story that we want to see, because whether or not you were satisfied with the arc of Anakin becoming Darth Vader in the prequels, the immediate aftermath of that is something that's always been intriguing to me, and it's something I've always wanted to see him. How did he really ease into that role? And this is something that I think a lot of people are clamoring for. But I do agree, Dan, that at a certain point, if it's just the further adventures of Darth Vader, I'm not sure how much more of that we need. But I do think stories like this that are filling in gaps are maybe not necessary, but are very welcome and can really inform the character quite a bit.
I would agree, Jeff. I mean,
that they have. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say then that the one interesting aspect of Vader in particular is that Vader, I think, seems to succeed on the screen in particular because he is sort of this foreboding presence that you don't really understand and therefore you kind of fear. But in a different medium, you can do a lot more with it because I think readers and fans especially who are reading the book can sort of bring their own imaginations to it. And then, as Jeff pointed out, when you're kind of in this connection, this sort of connective tissue, if we can call it that, between the movies, everybody, I think one of the great things about Rogue One is that how it connects so well from what we know to what we are now experiencing anew. And with these kinds of comics, we can go back and sort of say, wait a minute, I remember this, I remember this scene, I remember how I felt. And now we get to continue that feeling, and let's discover a little bit more with that touchstone of what we already know, which I think is the difficult and commendable balancing act that Star Wars has had to do as we continue to see it grow.
You both bring up great points, and I think that the central thing about using Vader is he must be used sparingly. He has to have an impact. You don't ever want your audience to be desensitized to Darth Vader. I remember in the late 70s, I was at an ice skating rink of all things, and there was a guy there walking around in what I thought at the time, being 7 or 8, a realistic Darth Vader screen-accurate costume. Whether my mind's eye is playing tricks on me or not, I have no idea. But I remember being terrified and fascinated at the same time, and I think that is the mystique that Darth Vader must capture. So you have to be really prudent with how you use him. And I also think, as I do with all of these stories, if the story's not worth being told, then don't tell it. I don't need to know every little piece of information about every single character on screen or on the page. A little bit of mystery and ambiguity, I think, is one of the things that serves Star Wars really well.
And all sci-fi, really. And it makes the movie stronger because it makes the universe seem real, as if you were to walk into another country and you probably wouldn't understand all of the local customs.
In addition to making it feel real, it makes the universe seem larger because, how many times have we read, especially Dan, you'll know, back in what we now call the Legends canon, the original EU, how often did characters we know keep running into one another, and it made the galaxy just seem smaller. It seemed tiny, and without knowing all of these stories, it does allow it to seem a little more expansive. But you're absolutely right, Dan, as well. If you don't have a good story to tell, don't just slap the character into a comic to sell some books.
Exactly, and there needs to be.
And that's one thing that Marvel, I think, has done extremely well. Every time they come out with a new miniseries, Matt and I start talking about it, and I'm thinking, do we really need this? Like the Darth Maul book that's out right now. I was thinking, do we really need another Darth Maul story? Turns out we did. We needed this Darth Maul story, and Marvel has yet to really stumble with the Star Wars license this latest round, and I have no reason to think they're going to this time.
I find no fault with your logic, sir. So we're going to go ahead and take a break. This was nice. This is one of my favorite things about this show so far in this early iteration of the new format is finding different personalities that I think are going to complement each other and bring a lot to the conversation. And I think we've got another A-Team series of co-hosts with us. So right on, guys.
As long as I can be face.
I was actually racking my brain to see if we could make a Star Wars reference there, like the A-Wing Squadron instead of the A-Team, but I didn't know if that would be too forced or too on the nose.
Forced to get it?
Yeah, see, puns within puns.
We better stop there. There'll be more puns when we come back, and we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will talk with Mike a bit more about running marathons of all things. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
You're listening to Coffee with Kenobi. Coffee with Kenobi.
Star Wars Digital Card Trader Collecting app from Topps is for you. Download the free app from iTunes or Google Play and collect your favorite images from the classic 1977 Star Wars cards to the Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels, The Force Awakens, Rogue One, and much more. Collect and trade with friends new and old through the Star Wars Digital Card Trader Collecting app from Topps. These are the cards you're looking for. A big reason for the success of our show is our CWK Patreon contributors, including Jason Hall, Dennis Keithley, Angela Souse, Mediocre Jedi, Mike Audette, Adam Leonard, Christopher Ripley, Swara Sala, Jared Cantor, BJ Smith, Eric Struthers, Nick Deco, Aaron Harris, and Mark Suter. It's a monthly donation that goes towards show expenses, equipment, and travel, and it makes a huge impact on what we're able to do in the studio, outside of studio, and just with marketing in general. And we have a number of incentives that help you get more involved with the show. For example, a donation of $10 or more provides you with a link to an exclusive Google Hangout, which we're going to set up really soon, where we're going to have our own video Star Wars discussion for an hour, just whoever donates 10 or more. It's going to be a lot of fun. Patreon contributors who could donate $35 or more will get the newest show 12 to 24 hours before anyone else. Then increments of $50 or more for a specific amount will give you access to all the previous rewards. And depending on your donation, we'll guarantee that you co-host with me and another guest co-host like the two gentlemen here for anywhere from one show all the way to an entire month. There are also t-shirts and coffee mugs involved, so you really can't go wrong. Be sure to check out the link on our webpage or the show notes for more information.
Yes.
We're back. We check in now with Mike Rodio. The Star Wars Show had a segment recently about Star Wars and Disney's recent combination. Of course, these two, the blend of these two has been nothing but amazing. And Walt Disney World and Disneyland have these half marathons, and they're themed. There's a Marvel one, there's a Tinkerbell one, there's a number of them. Star Wars, of course, is the soup du jour. It's always going to be on our show on Coffee with Kenobi. And I've always wanted to do it. I believe there have been 2 at Disneyland and 2 at Disney World now. And they had an interesting little thing about it. Now, Mike, besides being a Star Wars expert, he's something of a fitness guru. In fact, weren't you on Good Morning America last week?
I was, actually, Dan. Yes, that's right. I was doing jumping jacks for 4 minutes straight.
4 minutes?
Yeah. Well, we didn't know when this segment was going to cut in one direction or another. You know, there are about 7 cameras in the studio, and they're all sort of swirling around, and you don't know when the producer is going to cut to what camera. So even though we weren't in the shot, except for the first 5 seconds and the last 15 seconds, we just kept doing jumping jacks because no one told us to stop.
That's not something you're going to hear every day. Now, is this your first time ever going on Good Morning America?
Yes, certainly in my capacity as a professional, semi-professional jumping jack performer.
How did this even transpire? This is fascinating.
At the risk of revealing GMA's proprietary producing strategy, as it happens, maybe it was the day before the actual appearance, our digital photo editor got in touch with a few of the editors on the team. It turns out that her friend is a producer at Good Morning America, and that they were doing a segment with Dr. Ian Smith, who visits the show from time to time. And they wanted to mostly talk about nutrition, and the segment primarily focused on Dr. Ian Smith with Michael Strahan, but they wanted a few folks in the background to kind of demonstrate different exercises and give this segment a little bit more life beyond Michael Strahan and Dr. Ian Smith talking about sandwiches. So they sent out a call to our staff, and we had a few folks who were really excited to do it. Now, I don't know if you know this, but when they're doing morning shows, they get the production team actually gets into the office anywhere from 1 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the morning. And they asked us to be there at the relatively late hour of 5:45 in the morning. So that meant for me, where I live in New York City, I had to be up and out of bed at 4:30 in the morning and on the subway by 5 to get to Times Square, where the studio is, by 5:45. So it was a long morning, but we made it exciting. And then actually later in the day, completely unrelated, but later in the day, also as part of my job, I went to a press screening of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. So it was a long day, but it was a fun day.
It's a good day to be Mr. Rodio.
Yeah, it was. It was a busy day.
That's exciting, and I love. And you've got quite a prolific background too, which we'll certainly touch on as time goes on in future shows and what have you. But you clearly are in good shape. I remember when we hung out in London, thinking, "Boy, I really need to exercise more so I can look like Mike." It hasn't happened, Mike. But it's a little hard. I guess I chase around 3 kids. Does that count as exercise?
Absolutely.
Okay.
3 kids are not only tough to lift, but they move too. So that's what they call active resistance, and it definitely builds plenty of muscle. Absolutely.
So, I mean, you saw the show today, the Star Wars show. Have you ever run a half marathon? What goes into preparing for that?
I have actually. This is a strange story. I have prepared extensively to run a half marathon, but never actually run one. And it's because I injured my knee playing basketball a couple weeks before I was set to run the Brooklyn Half Marathon. So I had been training for months and months and months, but ultimately ended up not running the race. So I can talk about training for half marathons, but the experience of running one I have yet to get to. But I will. Don't worry.
I won't worry. I promise. So what when you train for something like this, because when you see the clips, you know that people of course you're going at different speeds and different paces, and I think part of the strategy is not to pretty much run as fast as you can, because you're not going to run very far, correct?
Correct. Yeah, you definitely want to pace yourself. And pacing yourself can be very difficult with anything longer, like a half marathon or especially a marathon, because that distance can be somewhat deceptive. Most marathon courses mark what distance you're at, but unless you're used to running that kind of distance, it can be very difficult to tell just how far along you are and to how to gauge the feeling of exertion, really. Especially because, and this is kind of interesting, when people are training for half marathons and for marathons, they are often not running the full distance of the race during training at all. A half marathon is 13.1 miles, and maybe depending on your training strategy, you will run at most 10 miles before you attempt that half marathon. A lot of people in the running community refer to their training cycles, and they'll talk about the long run. So every week they'll do a long run, and it takes many forms, but it can be a long run for time. So you'll say, I'm just going to run for 70 minutes and we'll see where I end up. And sometimes it takes the form of distance. So they'll say, I need to run 10 miles, and that's that.
And sometimes you do the form of being in the hospital.
Right. Yeah, that was me. So it can be, pretty challenging to handle a distance like this in terms of the actual, wow, you're really running for a long time.
So it's very intense. I'm even more proud of what Star Wars and Lucasfilm has done with this, because I think it's probably safe to say, and I've never officially been to one, so I'm not speaking with any authoritative power, but I feel like something like Star Wars, for a collector, they may not want to run or feel like they're in the best shape, but of course that motivates them to try, because the route you take is through a lot of the parks and kind of the back roads, and there are people cheering you on and Star Wars music, and I think that's pretty awesome. The thing that would motivate me to want to do it, honestly, is those Star Wars medals that you get when you complete these races. If you guys Google them, or our CWK family members, if you Google them, these things are gorgeous, and they're one-of-a-kind collectibles that I think kind of meet you in a different way, Jeff, don't you think? Because we always talk about collectibles and how they tell a story. This would tell a real story.
Yes, it would tell a story about how Jeff almost died trying to get the ultimate collectible, if I ever tried to get one. You're absolutely right, and I'm just still trying to figure out this whole idea of running for fun. We McGees are natural sprinters, and I don't run unless I'm being chased.
Which is Jeff, I want to let you know I appreciated that Lord of the Rings reference.
I thought you might. Thank you. Well, but yeah, you're the only reason that I've ever even thought about doing one of these is to get one of those medals at the end of the run. I'll be honest.
Well, it's a good reason. Justin Bolger, who's the social media manager for StarWars.com, he ran all the races, and they showed him getting all the medals, and it was cool. He's a big Dark Side fan anyway, so that was cool. And I don't know if anyone else saw it, but Matt Martin, creative executive from Lucasfilm, good friend of the show, they showed him sort of watching Justin run, and then he would basically, they kept showing him with different cups of coffee while Justin was running. It was pretty hilarious, I got to say.
Would be me, except it would be a chili dog instead of a cup of coffee. So
guys, why do you think that, I know we mentioned the medals and the scenery, but what is it about a Star Wars marathon or an Avengers marathon or whatever that would motivate people to want to do this? Because as Mike was talking about, it's more than just putting on a pair of shoes and running.
I have some friends who have trained for marathons over the last several years and have really gotten into it, and for them, it's all about the running. It's all about the challenge, pushing themselves physically. And I would imagine for them, it's also a matter of, especially if you're going to do it in some sort of costume, it's just a matter of pushing yourself even more. I don't know, Mike, is there something to that, do you think?
Yeah, guys, I absolutely agree. I was actually just writing a story about how to feel more confident when you go to the gym, which is actually a pretty significant issue. I think a lot of people feel the desire to be more fit, and they know they should be doing more to do it. But for some reason, once they get out the door or once they walk through the threshold of the gym, they can often feel a little bit lost, or they're just not sure what to do. So I talked to a couple of trainers who help people through this issue, and basically presented the issue to them, and they all eventually came back to one thing, which is accountability. I think they all ended up using that word at some point or another in our conversations. And basically the point they made to me was, if you can hold yourself accountable to something or someone, you are far more likely to begin and stick with a fitness routine. And, a lot of times you hear about the classic example of people trying to lose weight ahead of their weddings because they want to, fit in their wedding clothes, and they want to look good in all those pictures that they're going to have for a long time. Some people, it's a pure health reason. They have a heart attack scare, or, their doctor tells them they're really looking at some kind of big complication down the road if they don't turn things around. And that can be a motivating factor. And I think for Star Wars fans, whose motivating factor or driving passion certainly is Star Wars and that community around it, is the kind of thing where they say, you know what, this is everything I want in an experience. It's Star Wars in real life, in the flesh. You get a one-of-a-kind medal at the end. And ordinarily, maybe I wouldn't do a half marathon, but for this, I'll do it. And then that medal is in your brain every morning you wake up. And it's interesting, the half marathon season and marathon season really tends to take place in the spring and the fall, which means that basically any way you slice it, you're going to be training in either cold and rain or brutally hot temperatures. And so it really does demand a lot of that kind of day-to-day fortitude to keep going. So I think that's exactly what it is. It's about accountability.
Well, I also think, Dan, going back to what you were asking about what would motivate somebody to do something like this, I think if you're a fan, a fanatic, Marvel or Star Wars or whatever, you're always looking for ways to incorporate that into your life, in other ways. And I think that if you're a runner, it's especially easy. It's an easy way to incorporate two things that you're passionate about. And if it's something that, going back to what Mike was saying, if it's something that you are sort of concerned about your health, it's a good sort of entry level drug, I suppose, for if you want to call fitness a drug. It's a good way to get somebody hooked on it as well.
I think that's true. When Deanna and I were engaged, we did the Couch to 5K app that I know a lot of people do. And I had great success with it. I really, really enjoyed it. And Mike can definitely speak to this a lot more than I can, but I'd say for half the program, it was so difficult, but I just was so motivated to do it because, like you said, you want to look good for the wedding pictures or what have you. But once I got my wind, I loved it, and it wasn't, it was strenuous, but it wasn't hard, and I wasn't out of breath. I think it's that getting to that threshold that that moment where you realize, I think I'm in shape. And then I get why people are almost, I don't want to say addicted to it, but I get why there's a runner's high.
I will actually say I ran in high school pretty competitively. I wasn't especially good, and I was a sprinter for the record, but I never really got the runner's high part. I don't know if I'm a good enough runner or naturally to ever get a runner's high, but I will say for me, it was about community and being a part of a team. And you never wanted to miss practice because then your friends would see you in the hall the next day and say, where were you? So it was never an option. You always wanted to be there. And it's about that community aspect where you can say, hey, I did this. And it's interesting because one of the best ways to get people to follow through with things, especially things like diet plans or fitness routines, is to just have them tell people. I don't think anybody likes to see those gratuitous, self-admiring Instagram posts or anything, or Facebook posts. But a lot of times when people are posting about their fitness progress or their, commitment to a goal, it's their way of forcing themselves to do it because they can't back down. People say, oh, hey, when you're talking to your friends who are also Star Wars fanatics, hey, I heard you're running for that, or you're training for that Star Wars marathon or half marathon. And you say, yeah. And then you get done with that conversation, you go back and like, man, I really have no excuse now. So it absolutely works the same way.
I love it. What do you think? Should we try to motivate? What if a year from now, the three of us come back on the show and we talk about our experiences running? What do you think?
I think my story is going to be pretty much the same as it is right now.
There is a 5K, which I think is much more doable. I know that if you run the half marathon at Disney World and at Disneyland, then you get what's called the Kessel Run medal, which is exclusive, which is pretty cool too.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So thank you, Mike. That was great. So when we return, Tom Gross will join us to do the news. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
This is Coffee with Kenobi. Coffee with Kenobi.
Today is a great time to download the Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps. Recent additions to the app include the different poster images from the 40th anniversary. There are more retro designs. There's a lot of great stuff out there. They're spotlighting background characters from Rogue One, and I know it's been very, very popular. Another thing that I also love about the Star Wars digital card trader collecting app is that it features incredible images from many aspects of the saga, including the original trilogy, the prequels, the Clone Wars, Rebels, The Force Awakens, and, of course, Rogue One. It's also very easy to get into and a lot of fun, I think. Your favorite Star Wars characters, scenes, and moments are in every pack. After you download it every day, you open the app, and you'll get free credits to spend on the card packs from the Cantina. Plus, if you can't get what you're looking for, there's a place to trade with your friends as you complete your Star Wars collection. Plus, it's fun. And for experienced collectors, there are exclusive cards, special inserts, and even autograph opportunities. In fact, when we were at Celebration, we saw some of the actors signing these templates that they incorporated right into the app, so they really are legitimate signatures. And you don't have to worry about different cards that you're missing because you can sign up for notifications right on the app. The Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps can be downloaded for free from iTunes or Google Play. Be sure to download the app and start your collection today. The Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps is available now, and remember, these are the cards you're looking for. Segment of the show, and Tom Gross returns. And Tom, I mentioned this with you before, but of all the wonderful feedback we got on the last show, on show 67, with the new format, the most things I heard, of course, was about Jad, but they were also about you and the new segment. So thank you for bringing your energy to the show.
Oh, man. That is so cool. I really appreciate that. And, this is just a blast for me. I love this segment. And, Dan, I'm so thankful for you to bring me on board. This is great. So shall we get to it?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. The new Battlefront 2 trailer released and wowed everyone at Star Wars Celebration and those live streaming at home like me. And in an article referenced on Jedi News, video game creator EA announced that Star Wars Battlefront 2, which is to be released on November 17th, will have 3 times as much content as Star Wars Battlefront did at its launch. I know I was overwhelmed when I saw the trailer and heard the news. What is your reaction to this?
Do any of you play Battlefront?
Absolutely.
I played about 4 games of it before I lost access to the machine I had it on. But I would just like to remind everyone that November 17th is only just a few days after my birthday. Just throwing it out there.
And notably, it's just a couple days before mine.
Well, wow.
There you go. See? But no, I think this is very exciting news, and I think this is going to make. I'm not as hardcore of a gamer as I used to be, but this has made all of my gamer friends extremely excited, especially with the multiplayer options that are going to be available.
And Mike, you said you play Battlefront?
Absolutely. It's kind of funny to say this, but I have played Battlefront 2 extensively because there already is a Battlefront 2. As you guys probably already know, exactly. That was the second version of the initial Star Wars Battlefront classic, and I love those the ship battles in that. That's ship with a P, ship battles in that game. I think it seemed, judging by a lot of the release information I heard around the new Battlefront 2. EA seemed to hear a lot of gamers' comments that the initial DICE-produced Battlefront was a little bit limited in its storytelling scope. And that's why it seems like they're putting so much into the storytelling single-player campaign Battlefront 2, which I think for a lot of reasons, and I'm sure you guys have a couple thoughts on this, seems really exciting.
Yeah, there's famously no campaign mode for the first Battlefront of the resurgence of this with the advanced video game systems. I remember at Celebration Anaheim, there was so much buzz and such a huge line to get in and to try a sample or to watch more footage. Did you do anything with that at Anaheim, Jeff?
No. I'm trying to think. No,
I didn't either.
Oh, I didn't really. Again, I'm not as much of a gamer as I used to be, and I just didn't. It was not on my radar at the time.
I was watching The Big Bang Theory last week, and of course, I don't know. I know some people are not fans of that show. I think it's a great show. And Sheldon was talking about how, as he's gotten older, he sort of reached this age where he just wasn't as good at video games. But I'm totally there. Like, I used to play these things all the time. I'm talking Atari, ColecoVision, Dreamcast, Sega Genesis, a bunch of Nintendo systems. And then I have teenagers, and suddenly I'm my mother, and I'm playing these games. I'm like, which button does it? And I'm just, what a dope I turn into.
I fell off when things went into 3D. I stopped being able to play anything. That's what happened to me. That's how old I am.
That explains it.
Yeah, and sadly, I'm the same way. The last Battlefront I played was the PlayStation 1, Battlefront and Battlefront 2. I love the looks of this new generation of Star Wars Battlefront, but Dan, I'm with you. There are too many buttons. I've crossed that line as well. EA CEO Andrew Wilson stated that his Battlefront team listened to the feedback from fans, and they beefed up the content and will include new in-game locations such as Yavin 4's jungle canopies, the Starkiller base, and of course that spaceport town of Mos Eisley.
I've heard of that.
Never heard of that one?
I have. It's a good one.
Yes. I hear it's full of scum and villainy. Is that it?
You'll never find a more rich at heart.
In other Star Wars news, Hasbro held its Star Wars fan figure vote last month for fan-chosen 3 3/4-inch Star Wars Vintage Collection figure. Voting closed a week ago, and Hasbro announced the winner on May the 4th Be With You Day. The winner, and a reportedly close win, was Dr. Aphra. Dr. Aphra, who made her debut in Marvel's Vader comic and now in her own title, is the kind of good, kind of bad archaeologist who has a knack for getting into and miraculously getting out of trouble. What do you guys think of this victory for the Doctor?
We talked about her at the beginning of the show, and I knew this was going to come up again in the news, and I'm glad that it is because I'm completely thrilled about this. This is who I voted for. I'm even more excited, to be honest, because when I voted, I thought this was for the 6-inch Black series, and I'm not really necessarily a fan of that series. I respect it and appreciate it, but it's just not where I collect. I love the 3 3/4-inch line, so knowing that she is going to be a part of that, I think it's great. I'm completely stoked about it. I know a lot of people online were really pulling for her. I had not known that it was a close vote, but this is definitely what I'm going to get.
Me too. As soon as it comes out, I will have one in my hot little hands. This is the one that we needed.
This was the first year, too, by the way, that we were able to be a part of the initial vote launch that Hasbro reached out to us. So we had a thing on Coffee with Kenobi where you could get on and you could vote, and basically you could go into a number of websites to vote for a character's, and it was a write-in ballot, and then that's how Hasbro compiled their list of, I think, 5 characters to choose from, and our site crashed. Our site has never crashed, but when this was on and people were voting, I had to go to a different server, and I was like, at first I was worried that the site wasn't up, of course, but once we got everything rolling, I thought, this is amazing. Then Dr. Aphra and these action figures, as we know, this is a big deal. And
the thing that I love the most about this is the fact that we were talking about earlier. She's a female character, but she's an anti-hero. You know, we've had a lot of representation of female characters in Star Wars of late, but for the most part, they've all been heroic, which is great. But it's nice that we have a character that is not perfect. We have a character that is flawed. We have a character that is opportunistic. We have a character that's just a character, but also happens to be female. And I think it's great. And I think I just cannot wait to get my hands on this figure. As long as I don't have to have a 000 figure to go with it. We all know how I feel about him.
Right. I have to say, I did not vote for Dr. Aphra. She was on my radar for sure. But I love that she won though. I am going to say that. And I love, I just love the action figures. I voted for the Ahsoka Tano Rebels. Ahsoka Tano. Mm-hmm. I can't get enough of Ahsoka, and so I think that's what I just defaulted to that. But I do love the character Dr. Aphra. But I wanted to comment a little bit on action figures just in general. Yeah. That I think it's so awesome that action figures are still a part of the Star Wars tale. And I mean, how could they not? But when I think about how did we, when we were kids, how did we create our stories, our Star Wars stories? How did we, those stories that we made when, did you ever have, C-3PO rescue everybody? I mean, those are our stories. And how did we do it? With action figures. And I love to see the kids, we've got these awesome games like Battlefront, and I'm not saying anything negative about those, but I think it's so cool to see kids playing with these action figures and building their own stories. Did you guys have similar experiences as kids?
C-3PO never rescued everybody because even my imagination wasn't that good. But no, yes, everybody that listens to the show knows of my affinity for toys and action figures, so much so that I have my own podcast, Talking Toys with Taylor and Jeff on Marvin Neck Media. But I think the Ahsoka vote is perfectly defendable. My vote was a write-in vote for Jackson the 6-foot bunny from the old Marvel comics.
That'll happen eventually, I'm sure. The only reason I didn't vote for Ahsoka is because there already is a Rebels 3 3/4-inch figure of her. It was a 2-pack with the Ralph McQuarrie designed Vader, which of course is from season 2 of Rebels.
Yeah,
I'm looking at it right now. It's a really nice thing, but they're not that hard to find. I can probably find one for you, Tom.
Yeah, well, that'd be lovely. I'd love to have that. And you asked about the close vote. According to StarWars.com and an article right on Coffee with Kenobi's website, the runner-up to Dr. Aphra is the Rebels era Ahsoka Tano.
Well, there you go.
So continuing with, I hope you guys have been eating your apples because they say an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, not today, because continuing with more news involving Dr. Aphra, she has a new partner, sort of. Marvel Comics is following up its massive success of the Vader Down crossover with another crossover of Star Wars branded comics. This 5-issue crossover finds Dr. Aphra connecting with the reluctant Luke Skywalker to investigate the Screaming Citadel, an infamous castle located on the edge of space. The first issue released today, according to Marvel, and the Screaming Citadel is a one-shot, then continues in Star Wars issue 31, then down the road, Aphra issue 7. So, gentlemen, the Doctor's had her day with Vader. Can she top Vader Down?
I think she probably can. Matt and I talked a little bit about this on the last Comments with Kenobi. The cover for that issue looks phenomenal, and what we've seen of the Citadel so far, it's creepy. And I think this is going to be a fun story.
I think I'm looking forward to it mainly because Kieran Gillen is writing it. I must say, I'm a bit trepidatious that Luke Skywalker and Dr. Aphra are teaming up. I don't want to get so much goodness that I cross the streams too much, to borrow from another sci-fi reference. And also, when it comes to just the crossovers anyway, I was not necessarily a fan of Vader Down, so I don't think it would be hard to top that for me.
Here's my question to you guys to invite a little bit of wild speculation. Do you guys think that some of the characters that we are starting to see huge upwellings of fan support for, like Dr. Aphra, will appear in any of the movies, whether in the traditional episode 9 and beyond, episode 8 and beyond arc, or in any of the anthology films?
See, why not? Because there's already sort of an assumption that we're going to see Santa Solo appear in the Han Solo standalone film, which was a character that I believe, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe she premiered in the Star Wars comic.
That is correct.
Correct. So there's no reason to think that we wouldn't see, especially if the character continues to be as popular as she is. There's no reason to say in a few years we might not get a Dr. Aphra Solo film.
Well, Saw Gerrera, that might be a stretch. That would be amazing. But, the story group has already proven they've done it with what they did with some of the Rebels stuff, which is basically introduced in post in many ways, because you could just throw in an audio clip of General Harrison Dula. And, of course, Saw Gerrera has appeared in a number of mediums, and that's really, really exciting. So I guess it's possible. I feel like the individual directors who are working on episodes 7, 8, and 9 have been working on them for a very, very long time. Most of them before Dr. Aphra was even a known commodity. Now, that doesn't mean they can't retroactively go back and say, hey, maybe we should put her in the background or what have you. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
I'm okay with these characters living in the stories that they're in, and I always default back to this just sort of general comment of it's a big galaxy, and they don't necessarily have to. The stories can go side by side, and characters don't necessarily have to cross over with each other. At least that's the way I see it.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Got anything else for us?
Nope. That's the news for this week.
Very good. Well, thank you again for being our CWK newsman. We were talking at school about how we need to have some sort of an official title for you. And CWK newsman, that's fine, but we need something with a little more snap to it. So if you have any ideas, send us a tweet or an email or get a hold of us, and we'll see what we can anoint our friend here.
That would be fantastic. Would love to have a special name. So, hey, I'll catch you guys next week.
All right, thank you. We're going to take another break and be back with a conversation about a spiritual motif in Star Wars you may not have thought about before. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
You're listening to Coffee with Kenobi. Coffee with Kenobi.
Coffee with Kenobi is sponsored by the Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps. If you love Star Wars and love the excitement of chasing your favorite Star Wars collectibles, the Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps is for you. Download the free app from iTunes or Google Play and collect your favorite images from the classic 1977 Star Wars cards to the Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels, The Force Awakens, Rogue One, and much, much more. Collect and trade with friends new and old through the Star Wars digital card trader collecting app from Topps. These are the cards you're looking for. I also want to encourage you to check out one of our affiliates, cufflinks.com. They were kind enough last week to send me a new Star Wars tie in gray and some red slashes through it, and it's got Darth Vader in the background. It's very, very subtle, Very, very classy. They've got a lot of nice stuff there. Would either of you guys wear a Star Wars tie?
I don't always wear ties, but when I do, it usually has Star Wars on it.
Well, there's something to be said for the subtle integration of Darth Vader into formal wear.
Chat segment of the show now. It's my hope this is going to be our major place for the type of analysis that we are known for. Today's was inspired, ironically, by something a friend of mine, Caleb Baumgarten, asked me today regarding Buddhism and the Force. I was in the mornings. I get there quite a bit earlier than most people. I get there about 6:45. And so Caleb walks up to me and he says, "Hey, do you know much about Buddhism?" And I said, well, I mean, I know enough to probably answer a few questions on Jeopardy, but why do you ask? And he said, well, I was thinking about Yoda and that scene in The Empire Strikes Back when he's training Luke on Dagobah, of course, and he's moving rocks. And is that like a Buddhist thing? Is that inspired by Buddhism? And I told him, well, Lucas has said on many occasions that the Force is inspired by multiple religions because he didn't want to narrow it down to one specific thing. He wanted to show that the Force is for everyone. And I think with all the philosophical concepts and spiritual motifs that are in any type of story about the Force, I think that certainly holds true. But the idea of Buddhism is interesting, and I'm not sure how versed you two are on Buddhism or Eastern philosophies, but we were talking about it some more, and this isn't the only time we've seen rocks moved. Of course, in The Last Jedi, for the trailer, we see Rey moving some rocks. In the Clone Wars, Darth Maul's brother, Savage Opress, moves rocks in his training. And then in Rebels, Ezra does too. What do you think about that?
I would hardly say I'm an expert in Buddhism, but Star Wars was probably written more so for a Western audience, if we're going to run with that thesis. And I think a number of pretty insightful pieces have been written about how Star Wars mimics a lot of classic storytelling forms, whether it's Wagner's Ring Cycle or other things that they kind of borrowed from classical, obviously the Joseph Campbell. So we know that Star Wars is coming out of something of a Western canon of the hero's journey. And one of the things that strikes me about the Dagobah scene, you could say that's probably one of the most classic scenes in the history of film, really, is that it seems mysterious and exotic for a number of reasons. And it's in this swamp, and we have Yoda, who's kind of this curious character. But I think one of the reasons is that you start to suddenly feel like the Star Wars of what we're used to, with like the lone hero kind of picking up the sword and slaying the dragon, is starting to become unmoored. And somewhere in the swamps of Dagobah, we land in a different spiritual realm, where instead of there being clear good and evil and clear right and wrong, we have kind of this vague mist of do or do not. There is no try. And is the dark side easier than the light side? We're sort of starting to explore questions in a different morality or a different framework, and that's one thing that stands out about that scene. So when you're thinking about moving rocks, it always, I think, for a Star Wars audience, evokes that something is. We're in a different world right now. We're in a place that's distinctly unfamiliar to us, and I think from just a storytelling perspective, that's what it seems to evoke to me. I won't say that objectively, but to me, it seems that way.
Well, and to me, it means something different now than it did when I was a kid, because once the prequels came around and we learned about midichlorians, we learned that, every living thing has midichlorians. I don't know about inanimate objects, but you assume that there's something to that they do have some sort of connection to these midichlorians. So it's less about, I guess it's more organic. You're moving the molecules inside the rock as opposed to moving the rock itself as a whole. It is one of the most iconic scenes, and the fact that it is a recurring motif in the films tells me that Lucas was trying to tell us something. And what that is, I don't know. And again, I'm not any more well-versed in Buddhist philosophy than either one of you, probably less so. But I do think, Dan, you're right on point when you said that, Lucas didn't. I don't think he was necessarily aiming at any particular belief system. He was picking and choosing from several, so that, like you said, it would mean something to everyone.
Well, the Buddha, the Buddha himself was very much, of course, a spiritual guy, but he spent all of his major events in his life amid natural forests and trees, and ironically, or maybe not ironically, the tree is perhaps the most sacred symbol throughout the Buddhist world, the Bodhi tree, which I find certainly is an interesting connection. So we have Yoda as a possible Buddha-type figure. We talked a lot about one of the core values of Christianity, which is definitely not Buddhist. I think maybe the most important aspect of Christianity, or one of the most important parts, is sacrifice. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a theme in Star Wars that's more prevalent and more important than sacrifice on a lot of different scales, whether it's a sacrifice of your pre-existing values or insecurities, or sacrifice to the extent of giving up your life for your son, as we see in Return of the Jedi. The spiritual side is just really intriguing. The nature thing with Yoda, the rocks, I've been racking my brain to think about why rocks in particular. Now, obviously, from a practical standpoint, rocks are everywhere, so it's easy to do that because that's something universal, because rocks are everywhere, right? But so is the Force, and so is the spiritual belief in something beyond yourself. So it's almost like it's a concrete way to focus. And the rock, in Luke's case, could be sort of that mental block in him that says, I can't do this. I can't move this X-Wing. That is why you fail, because you're not able to remove the blocks or the blinders from your pre-existing belief that you are not as strong as you actually are.
It's also interesting, Dan, when you think about the nature motif in Star Wars. In pretty much, I think, almost the entirety of Empire Strikes Back, we are in either inorganic environments, spaceships, Millennium Falcon, asteroid fields, or we're in environments like Hoth, where it's obvious that the atmosphere is pretty hostile to life. The only animals we really see on Hoth are the Tauntauns, and of course, what happens to Luke's poor Tauntaun. It doesn't make it very very long in the tundra there, the icy tundra. And so when we land on Dagobah the first time, it's almost overwhelming. It's almost like when you walk out of a super air-conditioned room and suddenly you're in a greenhouse almost, and there's just lush greenery everywhere. It's almost overwhelming, and you feel the humidity. And he literally, he crash lands into a swamp. There's really no greater sort of awakening into, oh wow, for a lot of Star Wars, we've been on desert planets. Briefly, we're on Yavin 4, which seems fairly lifelike, although we're not really seeing a ton of fauna there. So Dagobah is probably the first time in Star Wars that we see, at that point, that we see a really strong instance of life. And when that happens, it sort of wakes you up to say, wow, this is a change here. And the other aspect of it too, and you're talking about removing the blocks and removing the blinders, in Luke's development as a character, we see him mostly trying to join up and go and get out of his surroundings and go beyond himself. And a lot of it is very external. We see him leave Tatooine. We see him on the Millennium Falcon. We see him, arriving in these new worlds, and everything is kind of fresh and new and a new adventure. And he's going outward. He's journeying outward. And in that moment in Dagobah, we sense that Luke as the character is finally starting to turn inward to understand himself, which is a little bit more of a deeper progression in his life cycle as the heroic character.
Clearly we're not a speculation show, but if you look at Rey moving the rocks, look at the size of the rocks that she's moving in that trailer. They're really small. There's a lot of them, but they're really small, so maybe her obstacles are much less than what Luke had to go through. It's really, really impossible to say at this point. Something we will revisit after we see the movie in December. I'd have to relook at the Savage Press training scene, but I think it's interesting that whether you are a dark side or a light side user, that's still an element of the Force that is palpable. And I thought for sure we'd talk a little bit more about midichlorians too.
In the trailer, when it shows the stones, I'm not going to call them rocks, the stones lifting up off the ground, it almost seemed incidental, like it was happening as something else was happening, that maybe that wasn't her goal. That's what it read to me. It could be way off on that, but that's what's been in my mind, just as another thought about that.
We saw it in The Force Awakens. She's very powerful in the Force, even though she doesn't initially mean to be. She just can't help herself. That's how much it moves through her.
And stones are sort of, as you touched on earlier, Dan, they're very elemental, right? We talk about trees, we talk about stones, and I think when a lot of people think of Star Wars, it's the Death Star, and it's the lightsaber, and it's the X-Wing, and it's these kind of human artifacts of the trappings of the space opera, right? And then when we think about, actually, if you think about it, one of the most enduring symbols of anything in Star Wars is a rock.
It's true.
That says something.
Good point. Yeah, I can't wait to see what other people say about this. Be sure to chime in what you think, maybe what is symbolic about the rock in this scene, or just in Star Wars in general. So we're going to take a break and return with your emails, tweets, and Facebook posts. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
This is Coffee with Kenobi.
Coffee with Kenobi.
Before we get the email, I want to thank our CWK sponsor, the Star Wars Digital Card Trader Collecting app from Topps. Be sure to support them the way they support our podcast, and remember to listen to new and archive shows of Coffee with Kenobi wherever you listen to podcasts, including iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you enjoy listening to your favorite shows. And if you listen to the show through iTunes, please leave us a review. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Pinterest, and we'd love for you to check us out there. Be sure to listen to our CWK family of shows, too, including Legends Library, Rebels Reactions, Comics with Kenobi, and Lattes with Leia. From Melinda Wolf, I enjoyed listening to your debut podcast under the new format. It sounded like all involved had a good time. I couldn't help but be a little saddened by James Arnold Taylor's comments about fading into the backdrop of Star Wars, which were her words, not his. Especially not being invited to Celebration 8 this past April. Although I haven't had any idea what his schedule may have been like, quite frankly, I bet he had more to do with the new organizer, Reed Pop, putting on this year's celebration. The entire event was wrought with all kinds of issues, and Melinda writes in parentheses, this was her 6th one, so she has quite a bit of experience with celebrations. She goes on to say, I know I was not alone in this assessment. Doesn't mean that I didn't have a good time. I enjoyed much of what I did during those 4 days. Just sadly didn't live up to previous celebrations. And Jeff, you and I and Corey have talked about this a lot. Celebration was wonderful, and being able to connect with everybody again was, of course, the main purpose of it. But it just had a much different feeling and atmosphere, and it just keeps coming up.
It does, and so I'm glad it wasn't just me, because, Anaheim was my first, and so I assumed that this was going to be a different experience. But it just felt, for lack of a better word, it felt more corporate. It felt more calculated. It felt more concerned with profit. And, as evidenced by the fact that they crammed, 70,000 people into the building. But yeah, she's absolutely right. I still, like you said, we all still had a blast, but it just felt like I missed more than I did the last time.
Well, I think the promises that were made about when we could get into to get wristbands and things like that, how those never really held true to form, made the preparation a little bit more challenging.
Exactly. It felt like it was being run by people who had never run one before, and I know that's not the case, so that's why I was a little surprised.
I've been to a lot of other conventions, as have we all, for different things, not just Star Wars related, and I know there are smoother ways to run things. I'm not going to say I could do a better job, because I don't think that would be fair to say. I think Mary Franklin and company do a lot of amazing things. And a lot of their helpers are volunteers, and they're volunteering, and that speaks volumes about them giving their time. And I think they were all very nice. I didn't meet a single person who wasn't friendly and helpful and courteous. But but that's a lot to do, and we know how much we expected of it. And Celebration is fun. It's not cheap, so I think we have lofty expectations, and I'm really curious to see how that's going to impact the next Celebration. Mike, have you ever been to a Celebration, or do you ever think you'll find yourself at one?
It's on the bucket list for sure, Dan. I sometimes I catch myself being way nerdier than about Star Wars than I had ever imagined, and sometimes I say to myself, man, there is a whole world for me to explore. So I think one of these days I'll have to get out there. That and Comic-Con. I
also need to consider maybe New York Comic-Con. Have you ever been to that?
No, I haven't. I think every year it comes up and the tickets sell out before I even remember to pick them up. So I was coming up from the subway, and I saw a young woman dressed as a Twi'lek with Darth Maul's distinctive face patterning, I guess, and in like full costume, full like I think head to toe patent leather of some kind, and I no one even flinched. no one was staring. Nobody was gawking. No, it was just business as usual. Just throngs of people going throughout their day. So that's New York City for you.
You gotta love that. Just another day in the Big Apple, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a huge thanks to Jeff McGee and Mike Rodio for joining me today, as well as Scott in studio. Gentlemen, where can people reach out to you if they want to ask you a question or just say hello? And feel free to share any projects with us that you're able to talk about.
Well, as I mentioned before, and I've mentioned several times, MarvinDogMedia.com is my podcast network. Talking Toys with Taylor and Jeff is kind of the jewel in our crown there. My buddy Taylor and I every week discuss toys, as you might expect with a name like that. You can find our shows at MarvinDogMedia.com, also on iTunes. We're also on Facebook. Marvin Dog Media is on Twitter. And I also, as you mentioned, I co-host Comics with Kenobi with the illustrious Mr. Matt Moore, and that is out on the first Tuesday of the month on the Coffee with Kenobi feed. And you can also hear me on the Geek Directive on the Assembly of Geeks Network, which comes out, I believe, every Tuesday now. Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the week. And that is at assemblyofgeeks.com.
And
we have a lot of fun with that.
Kenobi is definitely the best comic book podcast out there.
Oh, absolutely.
Mike, what about you?
But I'm biased.
Well, Dan, I am pretty active on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me at State Rodio, all one word. My last name is Rodio, so that's State, State Rodio. And via Facebook, my professional page is facebook.com/rodeo, or again, RODIO.reports. And as always, on mensfitness.com. Which I will admit, we do not have nearly as much Star Wars coverage as I would hope these days, but we do our best. We do our best.
Well, you do a great job, and I will be sure to put links to everything that you both mentioned on the show notes. Thanks again, guys. We're going to be back next week with 2 new co-hosts and more Star Wars talk. This is the podcast we're looking for.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.